Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be talking about the Formula One career of Daniel Ricciardo. So for Ricciardo, guy who had a very long career in F1, of course, recently ended this past season after being dropped from Racing Bulls after the 2024 Singapore Grand Prix. As of the recording of this video, I think it's highly unlikely that he'll get back into F1 in a full-time capacity at least. And so I think, during this offseason between 2024 2025, thought it would be a good chance to take a look at his F1 career. So for Ricciardo, his first steps to F1 started in 2007, where he joined the Red Bull Driver Academy. Of course, still in its infancy back in the day. The two main series I did prior to stepping up to Formula One in 2011 was British Formula 3 in 2009, which he won, as well as Formula Renault 3.5 in 2010, which he finished second in as a rookie. Then midway through 2011, the struggling HRT Hispania racing team, one of the backmarkers who joined Formula One at the end of 2010, struggling, decided to drop one of their drivers, Narayan Karthikeyan, and Red Bull, I think, paid a bit of money to the team to have Ricciardo drive for the team from the midway point of the 2011 Formula One season. So that's how Ricciardo made his F1 debut at the 2011 British Grand Prix, racing for HRT that year. They finished 11th in the championship out of 12 teams. For Ricciardo, that rookie season ends up finishing 27th in the championship. Of course, no points. His teammate that year, Antonio Liuzzi, an okay driver, not particularly special, I would say. He finished 23rd in the championship, of course, with 0 points. But given that Liuzzi had been there for the full season, Ricciardo had basically been dropped in mid-season. Not a big deal. Qualifying head-to-head 3-5 5-3 in Liuzzi's favor, with a median qualifying delta of 900ths of a second. So out-qualified by Liuzzi, but again, very close. And especially given the circumstances coming in mid-season, pretty good result there by Ricciardo. For my race model score, 0.601, so actually the better of the two drivers in the races. And of course, for expected points, 0%, as he scored no points. And of course, no poles, podiums, or wins either. Now, the following year, 2012, he's basically promoted to the Red Bull B team, Toro Rosso, and he would be partnering Jean-Eric Vergne. Now, for 2012, a very chaotic season, one of the best seasons, I think, in modern F1 history. Toro Rosso, pretty bad car. They end up finishing 9th in the championship. And for Ricciardo, he finishes 11th with only 10 points. Meanwhile, his teammate, Jean-Eric Vergne, finishes one place above him, 17th, with 16 points. But that being said, much better in qualifying was Ricciardo, out-qualifying his teammate Vergne 16-4 with a median qualifying delta of 2.68 tenths of a second. That being said, race model score negative 0.063, so pretty close. So even though he lost the points head-to-head, not that much of a difference in the races between himself and his teammate Vergne. For expected points, 53%, not great, but given that it was his first full season in F1, tire management not quite there, as you would expect. Toro Rosso also a pretty bad car. Again, 53% is not the end of the world. And again, Toro Rosso, very poor car, so no poles, no podiums or wins either, but that's kind of to be expected. Now, the following year, 2013, Ricciardo definitely took a step forward in performance in the races. So again, continuing the race alongside Jean-Eric Vergne at Toro Rosso, the team moved up one place further in the constructors, finishing 8th, and for Ricciardo, he finished 14th in the championship, finishing with 20 points. Meanwhile, his teammate Vergne finished again one place behind him, so just a swap of the positions from the year before, and finished with 13 points. So again, so after first season together with Vergne, where Vergne won the teammate head-to-head in terms of points, and again, according to my race model, slightly better driver. 2013, that narrative kind of flipped around, and Ricciardo was the better driver of the two in both qualifying and in the races. Qualifying, very similar story to the first season together, 15-4, the qualifying head-to-head in Ricciardo's favor, with a median qualifying delta of 3.64 tenths. Very small score, 1.004, so pretty good, decent sized gap there for Ricciardo. Expected points also improved as well to 72%, but still not quite at 100. And end of 2013, Mark Webber, Red Bull's kind of number 2 driver. I know that's a bit of a joke, and several quotes you could attribute to that. But he decided to retire at the end of 2013, perhaps kind of shuffled out the door. And for the new regulations coming in 2014, Ricciardo got the promotion to Red Bull Racing. I think, in a straight contest between Ricciardo and Verne, qualifying performance, definitely no questions asked. Ricciardo was better than the two. And in races, first season, pretty close, Verne slight edge, but second season, I think it was pretty clear that Ricciardo was the better of the two drivers. So pretty easy decision from Red Bull to promote him to the senior team. I was taking a look at some articles from Sky back from early 2014, looking at kind of what the media was saying about Red Bull's lineup and what the expectations were for the two. And honestly, very, very similar to the what the media are saying right now about Lawson and Verstappen. I know obviously very different situations, but again, a lot of the headlines at the time going into 2014 were that Vettel, 4-time world champion, with his young Antipodian teammate, he was probably going to wipe the floor with him, and it wouldn't even be close. And the big story would be, would Red Bull be able to build a decent car to challenge for championships, and would Vettel be able to continue his title streak? There was never really any realistic discussion about would Ricciardo be competitive or even beating Vettel right away. But that's exactly what happened in 2014. Driving for Red Bull, who finished second in the Constructors, obviously a very, very far ways off of the eventual champion, Mercedes. Finished third in the championship, 238 points, whereas his teammate Sebastian Vettel, 2 places below him in the Drivers' Championship with 167 points. Massive kind of shock in terms of teammate head-to-head between Ricciardo and Vettel, especially given the expectations coming into the year. No pole positions, but 8 podiums and 3 wins. Ricciardo, the only non-Mercedes driver to win a race that season. Very, very opportunistic whenever Mercedes had reliability issues, as they did in Canada, or when they came together, as they did in Belgium. Ricciardo was really there to pick up the pieces, and was one of the most more opportunistic seasons, I would say, from a driver. Out-qualified Vettel as well, 12-7, the qualifying head-to-head, with a median qualifying delta of 1.63 tenths. I think for Vettel, he really struggled with the 2014 cars. Obviously, those cars had a lot less downforce than the very, very stable cars that he won his 4 titles with at Red Bull. And I think he obviously, at the end of the season, would end up going to Ferrari. If let's just say hypothetically, if Ricciardo had been promoted a season earlier, 2013, I think Ricciardo would almost certainly not have been able to beat Vettel. I think it was just a combination of, Vettel was kind of not mentally there. I think he really wanted to go to Ferrari, and also just the cars not really being suited to his driving style. I think Ricciardo, used to driving much worse cars, took the opportunity very, very well, and was very opportunistic. But race model score 1.205, so better in the races, better in qualifying. Expected points percentage 152%, which is very, very good, especially for a front-running team. That's one of the best scores that I've calculated since 2008. So again, very, very good season from Ricciardo. And at this point, his star has just grown. He's super popular. He's known for having such a big smile, being such a super positive, happy guy, and being last of the late breaker. So this is really where Ricciardo had his breakout season, and where he became a real true superstar. Now the following year, of course, joined by a new teammate at Red Bull, Daniel Kvyat, replacing Vettel at Red Bull. Unfortunately for Red Bull, a pretty tough season. The car was quite bad. Really, really struggled, especially the early phases of the season. And I think this is a kind of a strange season statistically. Some of the stats points, for example, I don't think are entirely representative of the story. So for Ricciardo, finishes 8th in the championship, 92 points, whereas his teammate Kvyat finishes 7th with 95. Still outqualifies Kvyat 13-6 with a median qualifying delta of 1.86 tenths, which I think is reasonable. Honestly not that much different than the year before against Vettel. Race model score negative 0.134, but I don't think that really tells the full story. And for expected points, 95%, so again, a little bit below average, and again, a massive drop off from the 152% the year before. No poles, no wins, no podiums, only 2 podiums, not 0. But yes, very, very disappointing year for Ricciardo. The car was quite awful. I've been watching through the 2015 season recently on F1 TV, and you can see in early races Ricciardo tries to go for his late braking that he did all the year before. And the car really, really struggled, to respond the same way that I had the year before. So the brakes were pretty bad. So he wasn't really able to use the car the way that he likes. And I think also as well, quite unlucky. There's quite a few races where Ricciardo was the better the driver. The car was actually performing well that year. And then, mechanical reliability, came in the way, and, he ended up with no points, and Kvyat would end up with a bunch. Actually, the race I just watched, the 2015 Belgian Grand Prix, that's basically exactly what happened. Ricciardo was running in 4th, looked like he was going to get a big haul of points. Reliability meant that he ended up with none, and Kvyat ended up finishing 4th. So just races like that, I think, really swung the points in a way so that the points at least are not particularly representative of what the actual pace gaps were between Kvyat and Ricciardo. I do think, Ricciardo was definitely the better of the 2 drivers that year. Now, moving on to 2016, and of course, started 2016, lineup remained unchanged. Ricciardo and Kvyat together at Red Bull. Of course, at this point in time, Toro Rosso had this young driver named Max Verstappen who had a really impressive 2015, and there was obviously lots of reports that he was trying to get himself up into a front running seat. Now, lo and behold, 4 races into that 2016 season, Kvyat basically has this unfortunate crash with Vettel at the Russian Grand Prix, his home race, and just like that, Red Bull basically decided to drop him and promote Verstappen to the senior Red Bull team. And obviously, this would have pretty big ramifications on Ricciardo's career a couple years down the line. But taking a look at that 2016 season, Red Bull again improved after a pretty dismal 2015. They end up finishing 2nd in this championship. For Ricciardo, he finishes 3rd, 256 points. And during those, I think 15 races or so, with Verstappen, 220 points, whereas his teammate Verstappen ended up finishing 5th, a couple positions behind, but on 191 points. Not a massive difference between Ricciardo, who in theory is in his prime, and Verstappen, who's 18 years old and in his 2nd season in F1. Qualifying, though, still out-qualified Verstappen 11-6 with a median qualifying delta of 2.13 tenths of a second. And again, slightly better driver over the course of the season. Race model score 0.319. Ricciardo finally gets his first career pole position at the Monaco Grand Prix that year. Unfortunately, due to that pit stop disaster by the team, isn't able to convert it into a win, but still ends up with 8 podiums and would eventually get a redemption of his sorts by winning the 2016 Malaysian Grand Prix. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that it was a much better season statistically than 2015, expected points still below 100, only 98%. Now, moving on to 2017, this is kind of the first year of the new, mini set of regulations, a massive overhaul of the aerodynamic regulations. Unfortunately for Red Bull, they really struggled with these regulations the first year or so, and also combined with the fact that the Renault engine was still pretty uncompetitive, Ricciardo has yet to be in a title fight. And at the same time, you have a lot of discussions in Red Bull about how, from Christian Horner, Helmut Marko, about how Red Bull want to make Max Verstappen the youngest ever world champion. And obviously for Ricciardo on the other side of the garage, he's looking at this and seeing that the team is pretty much entirely focused on just that mission, making Max Verstappen world champion, despite the fact that, at this point in time, at least in the races, he's competitive, maybe the slightly better driver. But unfortunately, 2017 is definitely, one of the first years where it kind of becomes clear that things are kind of going away from Ricciardo in the teammate head-to-head. So 2017, Red Bull third in the championship, again the slowest of the big three teams. Ricciardo ends up fifth in the championship, 200 points. His teammate Verstappen ends up sixth with 168, so again 32 points behind, but pretty bad mechanical reliability on both sides of the garage. Out-qualified for the first time in his F1 career, out-qualified 12-8 by Verstappen with a median qualifying delta of 400ths of a second, but still a slightly better driver in the races according to the race model, with a 0.609 score in Ricciardo's favor. Excellent season according to the expected points model, 151%. No pole positions, 9 podiums, and 1 win that year, of course coming at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Now, coming in 2018, Ricciardo has an excellent start to the season, 2 wins in the first 6 races, and at that point, after that Monaco win 2018, of course, getting his big redemption for 2016, there was a lot of discussion about, is Ricciardo in the championship hunt, and all this talk about a 3-way fight between Hamilton, Vettel, and Ricciardo. Unfortunately, that would really, go in the gutter as the season progressed. Ricciardo suffered terrible reliability throughout the whole season, and as a result, comprehensively beaten in the Drivers' Championship by his teammate Verstappen, but that gap was obviously much bigger than it really should have been. So, for Red Bull, again, third in the championship that year, it's not really competing for the championship. Ricciardo finishes 6th with 170 points, whereas his teammate Verstappen finishes 4th with 249 points. So almost 80 points behind his teammate, but like I said, not really a proper comparison because of those mechanical woes. Out qualifying again by Verstappen, and this time the margin grows. So qualifying head-to-head 5-15, and median qualifying delta 1.74 tenths in Verstappen's favor. Race model score also for the first time goes in the negative 0.626, with an expected points of 115%. So the expected points suggest that Ricciardo, when you take mechanical reliability into account, still had a pretty good season. I would tend to agree. 2 pole positions, Monaco and Mexico, 2 podiums, and both of which were wins. So pretty crazy to think that he only had 2 podiums that year, and both of them came in those first 6 races. He had a couple other good opportunities later in the season. Mexico definitely comes to mind. But of course, this is again a continuation of where I think from Ricciardo's perspective, he really feels like the team is favoring Verstappen. They're still focused on their goal of making Verstappen the youngest world champion. And there was definitely some incidents this year that I think were definitely big turning points in kind of Ricciardo's mental process of, deciding what he wanted to do. For the first time in his career, end of 2018, he was out of contract, and he had the opportunity to either stick with Red Bull or try to build a team around him to become world champion somewhere else. 2018 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, I think, also was a massive turning point. That was, of course, the race where the 2 Red Bulls came together, and the team, I think many outside observers generally pinned a little bit more of the blame on Verstappen for that crash. Not 100%, but something like 60-40s, 70-30, that kind of thing. But if I think Red Bull internally basically decided to blame both of them equally, or if anything, blame Ricciardo a little bit more. I think that had a massive impact on Ricciardo's later decision making, where he would make the bombshell decision during the summer break to sign with Renault for the 2019 season. So 2019 joins Renault. I think one more thing that I'll just say is that, of course, mid-season 2018, after so many years of struggling with, to build a competitive engine, build a car that would work with that engine, with Renault basically going all the way back to 2014 at the start of the turbo hybrid era. I know they, of course, were together before that, but that was a very different set of engine regulations. So mid 2018, Red Bull makes the decision to switch to Honda engines. I think for Ricciardo, I think he also had a little bit of doubt about how good those Honda engines would be, and decided he thought perhaps the Renault engines would be a stronger bet. I think that did have a bit of an effect on his decision to go to the engine manufacturer Renault. So 2019 season, joining Renault, his first season there, teamed up with Nico Hulkenberg. I think everyone kind of knew 2019 wasn't going to be a championship winning season. Renault were still, a midfield team. And I think that the goal was, to have an eye for the 2020, at the time, the 2021 technical regulations that, would eventually be delayed to 2022. So for Renault, finished fifth in the championship, fifth in the constructors. For Ricciardo, decent season, finishes ninth in the drivers' championship, 54 points, whereas his teammate Hulkenberg finished 14th. So quite a few championship positions behind, but only less than 20 points behind, as Hulkenberg had 37 points. Better driver in qualifying as well. Out-qualified Hulkenberg 14-7 with a median qualifying delta of 1.27 tenths. Race model score positive 0.743, so better driver in both the race and qualifying, which I think is about what everyone expected. Hulkenberg was one of the standout drivers of 2018, but I don't think anyone really expected him to be better than Ricciardo. Expected points as well, good. In the positive 103%, but still not, I would say elite level. And again, no poles, no podiums, and no wins. Now, 2020 comes around, and of course, we head to Australia for the first race of season. That race doesn't happen, and we end up with this prolonged period of COVID lockdown. Now, during the time off, there's quite a few big decisions in the F1 driver market. Sebastian Vettel basically gets kicked out of Ferrari. Ferrari decide to sign Carlos Sainz from McLaren, and I think Daniel Ricciardo being a little bit opportunistic, and at a time where there was lots of news coming out from Renault corporate at the start of the pandemic about how long they were going to be in F1, were they fully committed to the F1 project. I think Ricciardo saw a bit of weakness there and decided that Renault were not entirely committed to this whole F1 project, and they weren't entirely committed to making an F1 a championship winning team. I think with that line of thought, I think the last few years has definitely proven that Alpine/Renault have definitely fallen off quite a bit. I think in terms of teams that are kind of would be thought to potentially make a step up to being a front-running team. So I think for Ricciardo's decision to leave Renault after only 2 years, basically after one season there, because of course we haven't started 2020 yet, I think it was probably the correct decision. And I think at the time McLaren looked like a pretty good bet. They were a team on the upswing after coming off of those Maconda years, and again, last 3 or 4 years would also prove the McLaren decision was a pretty good one. But unfortunately for Ricciardo, that season would be, though that decision to go to McLaren would have pretty bad consequences for him later on. But enough of that. We still have the 2020 season to talk about. So 2020 season, I think the big talking point in terms of just comparative order, the Ferrari get their engine nuked after 2019. And so you basically have a big two, Mercedes miles clear of everyone, Verstappen basically in third place for most of the season. And then you had a very, very competitive grid for the rest of the order. And Ricciardo had arguably one of the best seasons of his career that final year at Renault. So Renault finished fifth in the championship, but despite that, Daniel Ricciardo was able to finish fifth in the Drivers' Championship, which is, very, very impressive. 119 points. His teammate Esteban Ocon, who was basically brought in after they kicked Hulkenberg out for not being French, for Ocon, finished with 12th in the championship, 62 points. Pretty poor season by Ocon. I think some of that you could say, well, he had a year off and, coming back into F1. But I think we've seen quite a few times the last couple of years that drivers can come back into F1 after a year off and be pretty sharp. So, yeah, not a great season by Ocon, and, Ricciardo pretty much destroyed him. So, qualifying head-to-head, 15-2 in Ricciardo's favor. Median qualifying delta, 0.2 of a second. Race model score, 1.335, which I think is actually one of the biggest that Ricciardo's had over any teammate during his time in F1. Expected points, 112% as well, so excellent numbers there. And again, he gets Renault's first podiums since, I'm going to say 2011. First podium since the 2011 season where you had Petrov and Heidfeld getting podiums. I know Lotus, the team, got podiums as well, but that was technically not Renault. So yeah, 2 podiums, both very, very impressive. One at the Eiffel Grand Prix and one at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix as well. So 2021, coming off this excellent season, joining McLaren for 2021, a team that also had a pretty good year. And I think expectations going into that 2021 season were that Ricciardo was going to demolish Norris. Norris, promising driver, but still pretty young. And again, in 2 seasons against Sainz, wasn't really able to have the upper hand in either qualifying or races. But things would turn out to be quite different, much like they did in 2014. So that 2021 season, McLaren finished 4th in the championship. A pretty good car for them. Very, very competitive with the Ferrari for kind of best of the rest behind Red Bull and Mercedes. But for Ricciardo, very difficult year. He really struggles to adapt to the McLaren. The McLaren, a very unique car, as was said at the time, in terms of the way that it understeered a lot, the way that you had to brake, the way that you had to turn the car through the corners in order to get the lap time out of it. And Ricciardo really, really struggled to adapt to it. He ends up with 115 points, where his teammate Norris finishes with 160 and 6th in the championship. So again, not a great season, but still, it was seen as like not an absolute disaster. Out-qualified as well by Norris, 6 to 16 with a median qualifying delta of over 0.3 of a second. So again, qualifying a big struggle for Ricciardo in 2021. Race model score a negative 1.21, so pretty poor there. But interestingly enough, expected points 102%. So again, a little bit above expected. And I think for 2021, a lot of Ricciardo struggles were in qualifying. The races were still okay. When you take into effect where he was starting from for those Grand Prix, he was still, able to provide some decent points results. But it was really that qualifying 0.3 of a second gap where he struggled a lot. And again, got that final win of his F1 career at the 2021 Italian Grand Prix, which of course was his only podium that season. And as of recording this video, his final podium and final win in his F1 career. 2022, new year, new regulations, and unfortunately for Ricciardo, things just got worse. Really struggled to adapt to the new regulations, despite the fact that this was, seen as a fresh start. For McLaren, they finished 5th in the championship. Could have finished 4th, I think, if Ricciardo had a stronger season. But for Ricciardo, finishes 11th in the championship, 37 points, whereas his teammate Norris finishes 7th with 122 points. So for Norris, he has almost 4 times more points than Ricciardo. Absolutely destroyed in qualifying head-to-head 2 to 20 in Norris's favor. And again, median qualifying delta, very interestingly, almost identical to the year before, 3.21 tenths of a second. Race model score, pretty atrocious, negative 2.89. That's one of the worst, ever since 2008. And expected points, not even in the positive, a meager 55%. So qualifying performance bad, race performance bad as well. So yeah, just all around really, really poor season. I don't know why it says 1 pole there. It should be a 0 there, obviously. Now, 2023, of course, before we get to 2023, so 2022, Ricciardo originally had a 3-year contract with McLaren. And so summer of 2022, after, a really, really poor start to the season, McLaren made the decision to buy out the last year of Ricciardo's contract. And of course, that then sets off the fiasco where Piastri, of course, was signed by McLaren, and Alpine said, wait, he's our driver. Actually, we've signed him for 2023. They eventually get their driver, but it does leave Daniel Ricciardo on the sidelines. And for the start of the 2023 season, he basically accepts, a third driver, promotional role with Red Bull. Red Bull kind of deciding, hey, we can bring this guy in. We're not entirely convinced by Perez's performance. And, if things go wrong, things go downhill with one of the drivers in our program, we can just put Ricciardo in, perhaps. So 2023 starts the season as reserve driver, of course, and mid-season he has that test at Silverstone. Of course, at the same time, Perez is at this point in time, still doing okay. Red Bull's a dominant car, But the driver that they've signed for the junior team, Nick DeVries, is really, really struggling, and so Red Bull decides to drop him after the 2023 British Grand Prix, and they decide to bring in Daniel Ricciardo, see if they can turn his form around. And I think also, this was a very tactical decision, as it was meant to put pressure on Perez and kind of be, a backup in case, Perez completely fell off the map. So 2023, he starts the season, or starts his season at the 2023 Hungarian Grand Prix. Decent result there. Again, they go to Belgium, not a bad result there. And then they get to the Dutch Grand Prix, and unfortunately in free practice has a bit of a crash. It wasn't a massive crash, but unfortunately for Ricciardo, it ended up breaking his wrist, and he would end up missing the next 5 races. During that time, replaced by Liam Lawson. And I think that would, unfortunately, of course, set off a chain of events which still has ramifications now, as that injury by Ricciardo, that domino effect led to Lawson being promoted to Red Bull for the 2025 season. But for Ricciardo, he comes back from his injury, okay results again, but very, very small sample size. So he can't make a ton of, bold claims. And between the fact that he came off, didn't have winter testing, came in mid-season, broke his wrist. I think in terms of just analyzing the data here, a lot of it can just be, I think, written off. And I think as a result, expectations were quite high going into 2024. But let's take a look. So AlphaTauri finished 8th in the championship, and for Ricciardo in his 7 races still ends up finishing 17th in the championship with 6 points. His teammate Tsunoda finished 14th in the championship, but of course had been there the whole year, so no point comparing that. But during their time as teammates together, Tsunoda did end up with 15 points. Qualifying very, very close, 3-4 in Tsunoda's favor, with a median qualifying delta of 6 thousandths of a second. So the fact that qualifying was still so close, with Ricciardo coming back from his injury, and the fact that I came in mid-season, I think those were pretty good reason to believe that with a full winter of preparation, winter testing, Ricciardo, at least in qualifying, based on those numbers, you would say probably should be the better of the 2 drivers. Race model score a negative 1.256, but really sample size is too small, so we're not going to worry about that. Expected points was okay, 85%, but still not amazing. Of course, no poles, no podiums, or wins. Then we get to 2024, and start of the season, pretty poor by Ricciardo. He had a very poor string at the start of the year. No points finishes. I know one of those races he got torpedoed by Stroll. Another he got crashed out on the first lap with Albon. So again, a couple of unfortunate incidents there. But there very quickly seemed to be a lot of pressure on Ricciardo, and this was completely contrary to expectations. It was really, the thought was that Ricciardo was going to be the one putting a lot of pressure on Perez for that Red Bull seat. So I think Red Bull were pretty surprised that he struggled as much as he did, but that's kind of just how things went. There was a point during the summer break as well, during the summer break last year, where there was a lot of big discussions about Ricciardo potentially replacing Perez for the rest of the season. Perez at this point had already fallen off his usual cliff like he had done the year before, and there were, I think, a lot of, there's a very realistic chance that Ricciardo could have ended up at Red Bull for the second half of the 2024 season. I think sponsorship money from Perez's end, I think, did end up being the deciding factor. I think his sponsors really wanted him to stick out the rest of the year. And I think that was probably had a massive influence on the decision to retain Ricciardo. Or retain Perez at Red Bull and keep Ricciardo at Racing Bulls. But unfortunately, this really led to a shift in the mindset from Red Bull, in the sense that, if Ricciardo's performances weren't really improving, he was okay, competitive with Tsunoda in the races, but definitely struggling in qualifying. And I think at some point in the fall, they made that decision that, if we're not promoting Ricciardo to Red Bull, he doesn't really have it. There's no point in keeping him around at the team, and we kind of need to assess our options for 2025 because Perez is still struggling a ton. So, at the Singapore Grand Prix, decision was made to drop Ricciardo, and they bring in Liam Lawson for the last 6 races of the season. And that basically brings Daniel Ricciardo's F1 career to a close. So, driving for his stats for the season, driving 4 Racing Bulls, finishes 8th in the championship, finished 8th in the championship for Ricciardo, finishes 17th, same as the year before, 12 points, whereas his teammate Tsunoda, during their time together, finished with 22 points, of course, full season, so Tsunoda ends up 12th in the championship. Out-qualified by Tsunoda 4 to 14 with a median qualifying delta of 1.79 seconds. Race model score, unfortunately, also in the negative 0.705. So not great in qualifying. The race results also not great. Expected points a very meager 43%. And for Ricciardo, despite the fact that he ended up with 12 points, 5 of those came in a sprint. So he really only scored 7 points in a Grand Prix over those 18 races. And you can, make your argument about strategy. You can make your argument about, reliability or whatever. But the reality is he was pretty clearly not the same Ricciardo we saw during his time at Red Bull 2014 and 2018, or even at Renault in 2019 and 2020. Just for whatever reason, really, really struggled to adapt to these ground effect cars. And that effectively meant the end of his F1 career. So just to finish up, let's take a look at some of his career statistics. So 257 career Grand Prix starts, 1,329 points, 3 pole positions, 8 wins, and 32 podiums. All totals, I think, are, very, very low. And I think, if he had a bit better luck with cars, not necessarily with decision making, I think his decisions that he made during his career were pretty good. But I think if he had just had better cars, if he had, been able to drive one of those Mercedes, or if he drove one of the really strong Red Bulls in the last of recent years, he would have had much better career totals. Career expected points percentage, 110%, so that's very, very good. And when you look at that compared to other drivers since 2008, it ranks 12th overall out of 79 drivers. And out of the drivers in the midfield class, it ranks 3rd out of 32. So very, very good overall. Race model score as well, a similar situation. He ranks 13th out of 77 drivers. And in a hypothetical matchup against an average driver, his race model score would be 1.544. Similar situation in qualifying, where he ranks 10th out of 77 drivers. And again, in a hypothetical matchup with an average driver, he would out-qualify them with a median qualifying gap of 3.74 tenths. So for Ricciardo, I think he's going to be remembered as a driver with, a very, very big personality, a really, really popular guy, star of the sport. I think, unfortunately, he will... I think, after Sterling lost, I think you can definitely put Ricciardo in the conversation for best drivers never to win the championship. He never really got in a real title fight. The closest he ever got was those first 6 races of 2018, where he got those wins in China and Monaco. But besides that, never really had the car to be able to fight. Even when he was in cars that finished second in the constructors, they were miles clear of the Mercedes, which won that year. I think, besides that, later part of his career, when he was driving at Renault, still pretty good. But again, really, really struggled to adapt to the ground effect cars. And that kind of unfortunately, curtailed his F1 career quite a bit. If he had been able to perform a bit better, maybe he gets that promotion to Red Bull and maybe he's driving for Red Bull next season, 2025. It was just, so bizarre how it went from being so close to driving for Red Bull to simply being out of F1 in the span of a couple months. So there you go. There's my F1 career of Daniel Ricciardo. Thank you so much for watching. Let's see, we're up to 37 minutes. That's a long video. But yes, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.